I thank you for your continuing support and continuing viewing of these videos. I hope you enjoyed them as much as I have enjoyed putting them together. In this next portion, we are in Matthew chapter 23, verse 8, reading to verse 12, reading from the New Testament in Modern English by J.B. Phillips. Matthew 23, verse 8. Don't ever be called rabbi. You have only one teacher, and all of you are brothers. And don't call any human being father, for you only have one Father, and he is in heaven. And you must not let people call you leaders. You have only one leader, Christ. The only superior among you is the one who serves the other. For every man who promotes himself will be humbled, and every man who learns to be humble will find promotion. Now, when you look at the long scope of Christian theology through the centuries, what you see is that Christian theology, it has a pendulum sort of like movement. You know how a pendulum goes from side to side to side. And there is a sense in which Orthodox theology has that pendulum movement where we often go from one extreme to another, that there are these shifts through church history in terms of ideas and beliefs and practices. So high church worship versus low church informal style worship is one example. We can think of the issue of freedom versus determination, that you are perfectly free versus you are completely not free. Now, there's one other issue here we will throw out, which is germane to our passage here. There is the swing between anti-clericalism and the exaltation of the ministerial office. Anti-clericalism is a strain in theology that seeks to remove the distinction between clergy and laity. And in anti-clericalism, what it is a reaction against the abuses of the office, and you do this by making everybody one and the same, simplified version. In this view, there is no need for leadership in the church, which has gone through formal ministerial training and duly made ready and prepared to be ordained or set aside by the church. Ordination is simply that rite of the church where we recognize and acknowledge someone as fit, trained, and ready to take up that office of leadership in the church, which goes by various titles: priest, presbyter, cleric, minister, pastor, evangelist, apostle, so on and so forth. A passage like this one, which we just read, could be read in terms of a support of an anti-clerical position. And that would only be the case as you ignore the fact that Jesus, in and through this passage, uses hyperbole. For example, he says, don't call anybody Father, but your heavenly Father, Father. And I think we can recognize that if that is true, that, that doesn't make sense. No, he is using hyperbole to make a point. Now, theology goes back and forth on issues because positions lead to what could be called abuse. In other words, if we make being Christian completely an experience of freedom, that has one set of problems that eventually work into the system. If where the uncertainty of grace, we never know if we are saved. Whereas if we are fully called and elect, we provide a measure of certainty for those that are Christian. And so theology goes back and forth because the extremes often present problems that work their way into the system. Now, if you look at anti-clericalism, you can, for example, go back to the Kafar movement. I've used this in an earlier reading. The Kafar movement at its core was anti-clerical. They saw the abuse of the priesthood at that time, and in part, it's a reaction against, and that's what happens. We get rid of the abusive and misuse of the priestly office. Or we can move forward in time to a movement that doesn't seem on the surface linked to the Cathars, which is the rise of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which, is just in the process as I write, I believe, beginning its 200th anniversary of its kind of roots. And you cannot understand the Mormon movement unless you understand it grows out of a spirit of anti-clericalism. Why does Mormonism not have a set-aside ordained clergy? Because in its roots, it was a reaction against the perceived abuse and misuse of the clerical office. Now, what we are saying here is that when you look at anti-clericalism, it rises and arises all through church history. Now, we've looked at two movements that clearly are heretical, movements that on other issues have moved way beyond what is acceptable and right and correct in Christian teaching. If you look at the rise of the Anabaptist movement, or what we call the Mennonite church tradition, you see within Anabaptism a anti-clericalism that operates within the confines of the Christian tradition. So let me be clear here. Anti-clericalism is not by necessity an anti-Christian position, though I'd have to say many in the Christian church would struggle on the formal theological side to reconcile an anti-clerical position with an understanding of a Christian view of the church. And all we're saying is among Mennonites, there is a sense in which there is this side within that tradition that says, you know what, we do not need a formally trained, therefore set aside an ordained clergy to run the church. You see, it does not make a group heretical to reject a professional clergy, but it's not surprising that the rejection of the clergy makes movements susceptible to heresy. Because when you stop and think about it, one of the advantages of having a formally trained clergy in leadership is that these people have had the training on the basis of what the church is about, believes, and why. Go back to the Reformation. One of the issues is, as the Reformation unfolds, is that the rank and file priests in a lot of the churches in Europe were poorly trained, poorly educated, and in some cases not really all that conversant with the foundations of Christian belief and practice. Now, we talked about the Mennonites representing one extreme. In a sense, we could say when it comes to ministerial position, the Roman Catholic tradition represents the other extreme. In Roman Catholic teaching and theology, the Christian ordination is one of the 7 sacraments. And so they have a very, as it were, exalted view or high view of Christian ministry. Now, this also creates all sorts of problems, because if you follow the sex abuse scandal that has divided the Catholic Church and stained the Catholic Church, one of the problems at the core is that their view of Christian ministry is so high that it makes it, practically speaking, difficult for them to recognize that there are some people who are completely unfit for the Christian ministry, and therefore that there are people who simply need to be given the boot and shown the door. You know what? There is a standard of Christian ministry which is linked not to the position, but life and lifestyle. And unfortunately, in the Catholic tradition, their view of Christian ministry being so exalted, they cannot see that there are people who simply need to be kicked out of the church and allow the legal system of their country to deal with those people. In simple terms, the pendulum swings between the elevation of the position and the elevation of the person for position. So one side, at one extremes, would put the position is all important. The other would say it is the person and their walk with Christ is all important. And that's what counts, and not the position. The true Christian position is that the clerical order is important, and the people who fulfill that order, male or female, must live up to high standards. Jesus in our passage was not attacking the need for leadership in the church, leadership that needs to be recognized, supported, and encouraged in the act of leadership. What Jesus was attacking is the way in which leadership can fail the church. In the end, there is no one position on church leadership that will guarantee the sanctity of church leadership. We recognize that we need leadership. We recognize that we must put in place people of a fallible nature, people who are fallen creatures, who are sinful. We recognize that in every age, the ministry will fail the church, as the church will also fail the ministry and its ministers. We need leaders in the church who lead not by position, but by zeal for God.